James Turner sat in his high-rise office, staring out at the skyline of San Francisco. The Golden Gate Bridge was barely visible through the haze, but he had been seeing it every day for the last few years and never really noticed it anymore. Everything in his life had become a routine. Wake up early, drive to the office, tackle the never-ending emails and meetings, go home to an empty apartment, sleep, and repeat. The endless cycle of work had consumed him. At 34, James had everything most people could dream of. He was the youngest vice president in his company's history, worked for a prestigious tech firm, and had a hefty salary that most people would envy. Yet, despite all of this, something was missing. His success felt hollow. He often thought about his life a few years ago, before the endless meetings and stress, before his personal life slipped into oblivion. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his mother. "James, it's been too long. We miss you. I hope you're doing okay." He sighed and put the phone down. It had been months since he had visited his family. And even though he loved his parents dearly, he couldn't bring himself to face them. How could he explain to them that despite all his success, he felt miserable? He couldn't tell them he was lonely, or that the dream he had worked so hard for wasn't the life he had imagined. He glanced over to the photo of his younger self on the desk, the image of a man who had once had big dreams of creating something meaningful, of making a difference in the world. That James had been full of passion and ambition. But the James sitting at his desk now was a product of late nights and an obsession with climbing higher, achieving more, and proving himself. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "James, there's a message from Mr. Martinez." His assistant, Sarah, said, poking her head into the room. "He wants to discuss the upcoming presentation." "Thanks, Sarah. I'll be in the meeting room in 5 minutes," James replied, quickly shoving the photo into his drawer before standing up. The presentation was another step in his quest to cement his position, to ensure he continued on the path to success. But as he made his way to the conference room, a sinking feeling in his chest told him that this wasn't what he wanted anymore. He didn't want another meeting, another deal. He wanted something real, something he could be proud of. But he didn't know where to start. The day passed in a blur of meetings and emails. But as the office emptied out and the city lights began to flicker, James couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change. The realization hit him like a wave. He needed to get away. He needed to stop running on autopilot. It had been too long since he had taken time for himself, to think about what truly mattered. By the time he sat down in his empty apartment that evening, staring at the walls that felt more like a cage than a home, the decision was made. He couldn't go on like this. The next day, James did something he hadn't done in years. He booked a flight to the one place he had always dreamed of visiting: Japan. The tranquil temples, the busy streets of Tokyo, the quiet mountainside villages, it was the complete opposite of the life he had been living. He had no real plan, just a simple desire to disconnect, to find clarity in a place that was entirely unfamiliar. A week later, James arrived in Tokyo, feeling both nervous and excited. The city was a maze of neon lights, towering buildings, and people rushing by, yet somehow there was a sense of peace in the chaos. James had always been a man of structure, someone who thrived in the predictability of spreadsheets and deadlines. But here, in this new city, he found himself more relaxed than he had felt in years. He spent the first few days wandering the city, getting lost in the streets and soaking in the culture. He visited ancient temples and quiet gardens, places where time seemed to slow down. For the first time in months, he could hear his thoughts, without the constant hum of his work life drowning them out. One evening, while walking through the busy Shibuya crossing, James stumbled into a small cafe tucked away in an alley. It was the kind of place you would miss if you weren't paying attention. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, with jazz music playing softly in the background and the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee in the air. He sat at a small table by the window and ordered a drink, letting the warmth of the cafe settle over him. The barista, a middle-aged woman with short hair and a kind smile, asked if he was enjoying his stay in Tokyo. "It's different than I expected," James said, taking a sip of his drink. "I've never really traveled much before. My life has always been about work, but here it feels quiet, like I'm seeing things for the first time." The barista nodded knowingly. "Sometimes, we need to be far from everything to see things clearly. Tokyo is a city of many things, but also a city where you can find peace if you look for it." James smiled at the wisdom in her words. As he sat there, he realized that this was the first time in a long time that he had felt truly present. He wasn't thinking about deadlines or meetings, and he wasn't trying to plan his future. For the first time, he was simply living. The next few days were filled with more exploration. James visited ancient shrines, walked through quiet forests, and took in the serenity of the Japanese countryside. And with each passing day, he felt the weight of his old life lifting. The constant pressure to succeed, to climb higher, to never show weakness, it was all fading away. On his last day in Japan, James decided to take a trip to the mountains. He had heard about a remote village nestled between the peaks, where life was simpler and slower. It was the perfect place for reflection, and he needed time to think about what came next. As he sat on a bench overlooking the village, James realized that he had been running from his own happiness for years. He had buried himself in work, hoping it would fill the void in his life. But now, in the peaceful mountains of Japan, he understood that true fulfillment didn't come from achievements or success. It came from living a life that felt authentic, from following your own path rather than the one others expected of you. For the first time, James felt ready to make a change. He didn't know what the future held, but he was no longer afraid of it. He was no longer afraid of stepping away from the corporate world, of redefining what success meant to him. He was ready to find a life that brought him joy, purpose, and peace. As he walked back to the village, James took a deep breath, feeling the crisp mountain air fill his lungs. He had no idea what awaited him when he returned home, but for the first time, he knew he was going to find his own way, and it was going to be a journey worth taking. James arrived back in San Francisco just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the Golden Gate Bridge. His apartment, now empty and quiet, greeted him like an old acquaintance he hadn't seen in years. He stepped inside and took a deep breath. The familiar surroundings felt foreign to him. Nothing had changed, but everything had. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to do next. His trip to Japan had been transformative, more than he could have ever expected. The distance had given him perspective on his life, his work, and his relationship with his own happiness. But now, standing in his apartment, he was confronted with the reality of returning to the life he had left behind. The meetings, the emails, the corporate ladder he had so diligently climbed, it was all still there, waiting for him. But did he want to go back to it? James didn't have an answer. The next few days passed in a haze. He spent his time unpacking, catching up on the work emails that had accumulated while he was away, and trying to settle back into his routine. But every time he sat down at his desk, the weight of his decision pressed on him. It was like trying to put on an old suit that no longer fit. It was uncomfortable, and it didn't reflect who he was becoming. One morning, as he sat sipping his coffee by the window, James received a call from his mother. "James, I'm glad you're back," she said, her voice warm and comforting. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I know things have been hard, and I know you've been busy, but I'd love for us to spend some time together. You've been working so much, and I just want to make sure you're okay." Max smiled at the concern in her voice. His mother had always been supportive, but he hadn't been the best at keeping in touch over the last few years. He'd been too wrapped up in his own world to realize how much he had been neglecting the people who cared about him. "I'd love to, Mom. How about we go for lunch this weekend?" James replied, feeling the warmth of the connection. "That sounds perfect," she said. "I'll make a reservation at the place we love. Can't wait to see you." After hanging up, James leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of relief. It had been too long since he had spent time with his family. Maybe reconnecting with them would help him get some clarity about his next steps. The weekend arrived, and James met his mother at a small Italian restaurant in the city. It was a place they frequented when he was growing up, a place where they would sit for hours over pasta and wine, talking about life and everything in between. It felt familiar, and for the first time since his return, it felt right. As they sat at the table, James couldn't help but notice how much his mother had aged in the past few years. Her hair had turned silver, and there were lines on her face that hadn't been there before. She looked at him with the same warmth she always had, but there was an underlying sadness in her eyes, a subtle reflection of the distance that had grown between them. "James," she began, after taking a sip of wine, "I've been meaning to ask you, how are you really doing? I know you've been busy with work, but I can see you've been carrying something heavy with you. Is everything okay?" James looked down at his glass of water, his fingers tracing the rim. He had always been good at masking his feelings, at pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. But sitting across from his mother, he knew he couldn't keep pretending anymore. "I don't know, Mom," he said quietly. "I've been feeling lost. I've worked so hard to build this life, but now that I've achieved everything I thought I wanted, I don't feel fulfilled. It's like I'm missing something, but I don't know what it is. I don't know who I am without work, without the success." His mother reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. James, success is not just about what you achieve. It's about who you become in the process. I think you've been so focused on climbing that you've forgotten to enjoy the view. You've forgotten to be kind to yourself. James felt a lump form in his throat. His mother had always been wise, but hearing her words now, in this moment, it felt like a wake-up call. I've been running, Mom, he admitted. I've been running from what really matters, from the people who love me, from the things I care about. I've been so focused on the future, on getting to the next step, that I didn't stop to think about whether this is the life I actually want. His mother smiled softly. It's never too late to change, James. Sometimes, we need to step away from everything to find the answers. You're doing that now, and that's the first step toward figuring out what's truly important to you. Later that day, as James walked back to his apartment, he felt a shift inside. The conversation with his mother had opened something in him, a door that had been closed for too long. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel vulnerable, to admit that he didn't have all the answers. But that was okay. He didn't need to know everything right now. He had taken the first step on his journey of rediscovery. And maybe that was all he needed to do, to take one small step at a time, and trust that the answers would come when he was ready to hear them. The next few weeks were filled with small changes. James stopped putting in 16-hour workdays. He took time to call his friends, reconnect with old colleagues, and spend weekends doing things he had always enjoyed but never had time for: hiking in nature, reading novels, and even starting to sketch again, something he had loved doing as a child. He still didn't know exactly what he wanted to do with his life. But one thing was becoming clear. His old career path, his old ways of thinking, no longer held the same appeal. James was slowly starting to realize that true happiness wasn't something you could plan or control. It was something you had to allow yourself to experience. And for the first time in years, James felt hopeful. Hopeful that he was finally on the right path, even if he didn't know exactly where it would lead. James awoke to a gray morning in San Francisco. The city was blanketed in fog, a familiar sight that he had often taken for granted. The fog felt symbolic today. For the first time in a long while, James realized he was in a space of uncertainty, something he had never been comfortable with. His life had always been a calculated series of steps: achieve this, then that, then the next thing. Now, he was stepping into unknown territory, and it was both liberating and terrifying. The week after his conversation with his mother had been eye-opening. He had spent a lot of time reflecting, a lot of time asking himself hard questions. What did he want from life? Was he supposed to return to the corporate grind? Was there a way to reconcile the person he had become with the dreams he once had? But the most important realization he had come to was this: he didn't have to have all the answers. For years, he had lived with the belief that life was a series of goals to accomplish, a checklist that would bring him happiness once it was completed. He had worked tirelessly, climbed the corporate ladder, gained recognition, and acquired wealth. But none of that had brought him the fulfillment he craved. So, now, maybe it was time to step back and approach life from a different angle. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from his old colleague Sean, who had worked with him on several big projects. James, I've been thinking about you lately. We should catch up. I know you've been going through some changes, and I think you could use some perspective. Let's grab a drink sometime soon. James smiled at the message. Sean had always been a good friend, and even though they had lost touch over the years as James got more absorbed in his work, he knew Sean would understand. He had a similar drive for success, but Sean had always balanced it with a passion for life outside of the office. James quickly replied, "That sounds good. Let's meet tomorrow. I'll text you later with a time." The evening came quickly, and James found himself walking into one of the quietest bars in the city. The place was dimly lit, with a comfortable, almost nostalgic atmosphere. It was the kind of place where you could hear yourself think, a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of the corporate world he had been a part of. Sean was already there, sitting at a corner table, his easy smile welcoming James as he approached. "James, it's been too long, my friend," Sean said, standing up to give him a hug. "You look different in a good way, of course." James chuckled, sitting down across from him. "Yeah, it's been a crazy couple of months. I've been figuring some things out." Sean raised an eyebrow. "Figuring things out? Sounds like there's a story there." James took a deep breath and began to explain. "I went to Japan. Just took off. Spent time traveling, reflecting. And honestly, I think I've been running away from what I really need to face in my life. My career, my relationships, I've built all these things, but I haven't stopped to ask if they're what I really want." Sean listened carefully, nodding thoughtfully. Man, I'm glad you went to Japan. I think you needed that break. But I get what you're saying. You've been so focused on the next promotion, the next project. The thing is, most people don't stop to realize that chasing the next thing doesn't bring happiness. It's a moving target. James smiled, grateful for Sean's perspective. Exactly. But the problem is, I don't know what I want next. I don't know what's going to make me happy. For so long, everything was about climbing higher. But now, I feel like I'm lost. Sean took a sip of his drink, setting it down before meeting James's eyes. You don't have to have it all figured out right away. Life's not about finding some one big purpose. Sometimes it's about small daily things that bring you fulfillment. It's about being open to change and giving yourself permission to explore. James leaned back in his chair, letting Sean's words sink in. I've always been so focused on the big picture, on having a grand plan. But I guess I'm starting to realize that the journey itself, even without the answers, can be valuable. Exactly, Sean said with a grin. Look, it's never easy to change, especially when you've spent so many years building something. But trust me, the best parts of life happen when you step into the unknown. You don't always need a roadmap. Sometimes you just need to be brave enough to take that first step, even if you don't know exactly where you're going. James sat in silence for a moment, taking it all in. The conversation with Sean had been what he needed, a reminder that it was okay not to have everything figured out. He didn't need to know where his life would take him, as long as he was open to what came next. The following days were a blur of introspection and small actions. James didn't rush into anything, but he made conscious decisions to take time for himself for things that had always been pushed aside by his work. He visited places in the city he had never had the chance to explore. He spent more time in nature, going on long hikes and walks in Golden Gate Park, and finally, he started painting again. As he took these small steps, James realized that he was reconnecting with parts of himself he had long forgotten. He began to embrace uncertainty, to let go of the need for a perfect plan. For the first time in years, he felt alive, free from the pressure of having to define every aspect of his life. The more time he spent away from work, the clearer it became that he needed to redefine what success meant for him. It was no longer about climbing the corporate ladder or gaining recognition from others. Success, James was starting to understand, was about being true to himself, following his passions, and living with intention. It was on one of his solo walks in the park that James had another realization. He didn't need to do this alone. He wasn't the first person to question their path in life, and he didn't have to hide his struggles. He had friends, like Sean, who had their own stories of reinvention, and they had made it through to the other side. As he sat on a park bench, watching the sunset over the bay, James made a decision. He was going to start a new chapter 1, where he was not defined by his career, but by his ability to live fully, to explore the unknown without fear, and to build meaningful connections. The future was uncertain, but for the first time he was excited to face it, one step at a time. James woke up to the sound of his alarm ringing, but for the first time in weeks, the sound didn't feel like a call to duty. It was simply the start of another day, a day he was beginning to feel more in control of, a day that wasn't ruled by deadlines or obligations. He had spent the last few weeks embracing the uncertainty he had been so afraid of, and now he was beginning to feel something that had been missing for years, a sense of freedom. For the first time in his adult life, he had a schedule that didn't revolve around work. He had been finding new ways to fill his time painting, taking long walks in Golden Gate Park, and finally making time to meet friends he had neglected over the years. But there was still one thing James was avoiding, the question of what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. There were days when he felt like he was on the verge of something great, and other days when he was overwhelmed with doubt. He was still uncertain about the future, but one thing had become clear. He couldn't go back to his old life. The corporate world, with its constant pressures and expectations, no longer held the same appeal. The life he had worked so hard to build now seemed like a cage, and James couldn't ignore the pull of something else, something more meaningful. That morning, after his usual routine of a quiet breakfast and a walk around the neighborhood, James sat down at his desk. He had been toying with the idea of taking a sabbatical, a long break to focus on personal projects and rediscover his passions. But there was still something holding him back: fear of the unknown. Fear of stepping away from the comfortable, the predictable. He opened his laptop and began researching. Maybe it wasn't as drastic as quitting everything. Maybe he could start small. Maybe he could dedicate time to something that had always sparked his interest, but had never been given the space it deserved: writing. He had always enjoyed writing, but it had always been relegated to the back burner, overshadowed by his career ambitions. James quickly opened a blank document and stared at the blinking cursor. The page was empty, as was his mind. What should he write about? He had so many ideas, but no clear direction. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought back to the simplicity of his time in Japan. The peaceful temples, the quiet moments by the sea, the long hours spent reflecting. He had found solace in the act of observation, in writing down his thoughts and feelings without judgment. What if he could share that experience with others? What if he could write about his journey, the inner transformation he had gone through since leaving his corporate life behind? With that thought in mind, he began typing. The next few weeks were a blur of new beginnings. James dedicated himself to writing every day, pouring his thoughts onto the page. At first, it felt clumsy. His words didn't flow as easily as he hoped, and there were moments when he doubted his ability to create something worth reading. But he kept going, drawing on his experiences, the fear, the uncertainty, the small victories. Each sentence felt like a step forward, each paragraph a little bit more of him on paper. He still didn't have a clear vision for what he wanted to do with his writing, but for the first time in years, he wasn't worried about it. He was enjoying the process, savoring the simple act of creation. This was his time, and for once, he didn't feel the need to hurry. He wasn't chasing after something anymore, he was living it. One evening, as he sat at his desk typing away, his phone buzzed with a message from Sean. "Hey man, I've been thinking a lot about you lately. I know you've been working on some personal projects, but I wanted to know if you've considered the possibility of writing a book. I think you've got a story that could help a lot of people." James paused, staring at the message. A book? It was a thought that had crossed his mind before, but he had never seriously entertained it. Writing a book seemed like a huge commitment, a monumental task. But now, as he reread Sean's words, he felt something stir inside him. Could it be possible? He quickly typed a response. "Funny you mention that. I've actually been thinking about it. I've started writing about my journey, about the changes I've gone through. It feels right, but I don't know where to start with something as big as a book." Sean replied almost instantly. "I think it's about taking the first step, man. Don't worry about the whole thing at once. Just keep writing. Start with what feels real to you." James felt a surge of excitement. For the first time in a while, the uncertainty of the future didn't feel overwhelming. He wasn't trying to force an outcome anymore. He was simply doing what felt right, and that felt good. The next few days were filled with energy and anticipation. James found himself waking up early, eager to get to work on his writing. He started sketching out the outline for the book, letting his thoughts flow freely without trying to force structure. The book would be about his journey of rediscovery, about stepping away from the corporate world to find something more meaningful. It would be a story of transformation, of embracing uncertainty, and of learning to live with intention. He reached out to a few friends who had published books, asking for advice and guidance. Their responses were encouraging. They told him that writing a book wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. It was about staying committed to the process, even when doubt crept in. Max felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. This was it. This was the direction he was supposed to go in. It wasn't about chasing success anymore. It was about creating something that reflected who he was and what he had learned. One evening, after another productive writing session, Max sat back in his chair and looked out at the city. The fog had rolled in, and the city lights twinkled below like a sea of stars. He had taken the first step. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, he no longer felt afraid. He was no longer defined by his career or his past mistakes. He was creating something new, something that felt true to who he was now. In the coming months, James would continue to write, to shape his story into something that could inspire others. He would share the lessons he had learned, the mistakes he had made, and the freedom that came with stepping into the unknown. But for now, as he sat in his quiet apartment, James allowed himself to savor this moment, the moment when he had finally taken the leap into something new. The weeks turned into months, and James found himself more deeply immersed in his writing than he had ever been in his career. His mornings now started with a cup of coffee and a quiet hour at his desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he poured his thoughts onto the page. The more he wrote, the more he realized how much he had been holding back, how many feelings and experiences he had never fully acknowledged until now. At first, it was difficult. His old habits, the ones built around his corporate life, kept creeping back in. The desire for perfection, the need to prove that he could succeed at anything he touched, even in this new endeavor. But as the weeks passed, he started letting go of those expectations. He began to embrace the messiness of the creative process. There were days when he wrote pages of content that didn't make it into the book, and other days when he couldn't seem to write a single word. It was frustrating, but it was also freeing. James had always been a man of control, of precision, but in writing, he was learning to surrender to the unknown, to trust that the words would come when they were ready. And when they did, it felt like magic. However, even as his passion for writing grew, there was a lingering fear in the back of his mind. The fear of letting go of his old life. What if the book didn't work out? What if it was a failure? What if he wasn't able to build a new career, a new identity, without the security and stability that his corporate job had provided? Every time these thoughts crept into his mind, James would pause and take a deep breath. This was the challenge, the essence of the leap he had taken. He wasn't just writing a book, he was reimagining his entire life. And in doing so, he was learning to release the control that had once defined him. But the fear was real. And it wasn't just about his career. It was also about his relationships. He had spent so much of his life focusing on work that he had neglected the people around him. His friends, his family, even his ex-wife, they had all been affected by his obsession with success. He had isolated himself in the pursuit of achievement, and now he was trying to rebuild those connections. But would it be too late? One afternoon, as James sat in his favorite cafe, scribbling notes for a new chapter, his phone buzzed with a message from his mother. "James, I'm so proud of you. I know this journey has been hard, but I can see you're making progress. But I've been thinking, have you considered reaching out to your father? I know things were strained between you two, but I think it could help you heal some old wounds." James stared at the message for a long time, his heart tightening. His father, the man who had always been distant, who had pushed him to work harder, to be better, to climb higher. The man who had never really understood him. Their relationship had been strained for years, and James had all but given up on the idea of reconciliation. But his mother's words lingered in his mind. Could reaching out to his father bring closure? Could it help him move forward? For the first time in months, James thought about his father with a new perspective. He had been so focused on the resentment and anger that had built up between them over the years, but now he began to wonder if that anger had been an obstacle to healing. Perhaps the real journey wasn't just about letting go of his old life, but also about forgiving not just others, but himself. That evening, James sat down to write an email to his father. The words didn't come easily. He wasn't sure what to say or how to say it, but he knew he had to try. He had to be vulnerable, something he had never allowed himself to be in the past. "Dad, I know we've had our differences. I've been reflecting a lot lately, and I realize that I've held on to a lot of resentment towards you. I've blamed you for things that weren't always in your control, and I want to take responsibility for that. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I would like to try to rebuild our relationship if you're open to it." He hesitated for a moment before pressing send. It felt like a leap, a step into the unknown, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what would come of it. But he also knew that letting go of the past, forgiving both his father and himself, was a crucial part of his journey. The next few days were filled with uncertainty. James tried not to overthink the email. He focused on his writing, went on his daily walks, and continued working on his new life. But there was a part of him that couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake, if his father would even respond. Finally, a week later, James received a reply. "James, I wasn't sure if I'd ever hear from you again. I've thought about you often, but I never knew how to reach out. I can't undo the past, but I can say that I'm sorry for the ways I've failed you. I'd like to talk. If you're willing, let's find a time to meet." James stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. The door was open, and it was up to him to walk through it. He immediately typed back, "Thank you, Dad. I think this is the first step. I'll reach out to set a time soon." In the weeks that followed, James and his father began to rebuild their relationship, slowly and carefully. Their meetings were tentative at first, full of awkward silences and unspoken words. But as time passed, they began to talk more openly, addressing the years of distance and misunderstanding. It wasn't easy, and there were times when old wounds reopened, but James felt a sense of healing he hadn't expected. And through it all, he continued to write. His book, which had once been a solitary pursuit, began to take shape. It became not just a reflection of his journey, but a way to share his story of reconciliation and growth. He wrote about forgiveness, about the importance of letting go of the past in order to move forward. And in doing so, he realized that he was writing his own path to peace. As the months passed, James's fear of the unknown began to fade. He was no longer afraid of letting go, of stepping into a life he couldn't control. He had taken the leap into writing, into healing, and into a new way of living. And for the first time in a long time, James was beginning to feel at home in his own life. The fog had lifted from the streets of San Francisco as James sat by the window, his gaze drifting over the city he had always called home. But now, it didn't feel like the place where he belonged anymore. In the time since he had started his journey of self-discovery, everything had changed. His perspective had shifted not only on work and life, but also on the city itself. What once felt like a labyrinth of ambition and success now seemed small and suffocating, like a box he was no longer willing to stay in. James had been back in the city for a few months now, but he was no longer the same man who had left for Japan. He had shed his old skin, the work-obsessed, driven man who thought success came only from climbing higher. He had embraced uncertainty, explored new passions, and even reconnected with his father. But there was still a part of him that yearned for something more. He knew he had to let go of the old life entirely before he could truly move forward. The book, still in progress, had become a reflection of that process. He had written about the hardships he had faced, the moments of doubt, the fears of failure that had haunted him for years. But he had also written about the beauty of self-discovery, about the quiet moments of clarity that had led him to the realization that he didn't need to be defined by his past. And it wasn't just the book that had taken shape. James had started to entertain the idea of sharing his journey with others, speaking at events, mentoring those who felt lost or disconnected, and using his experience to help others find their own way. The thought of it still made him nervous, but there was a spark of excitement too. For the first time, he could see himself as more than just a corporate success story. He could see himself as someone with a purpose beyond climbing ladders and closing deals. One evening, as James sat in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a notification from his old friend Sean. "Hey man, how's the book coming along? I've been thinking about what you said the other night. I think you should do something with this speak about your journey. There are people out there who could really benefit from hearing your story. Let me know if you need help with anything." James stared at the message for a while. He had thought about speaking publicly, but the idea still felt intimidating. What if no one was interested? What if he wasn't good enough? But Sean's encouragement made him pause. Maybe this was the push he needed to step outside of his comfort zone. He had spent so much time hiding behind the walls of his old life, afraid to be vulnerable, to share the truth of his journey with others. But now, after everything he had learned, the thought of not sharing it felt like a waste. His story was one of struggle and triumph, of growth and healing, and he couldn't keep it locked away. The next few days were filled with planning. James didn't know where to begin, but he knew that taking the first step would be enough. He reached out to a few friends in the speaking circuit, asking for advice, and slowly started outlining the themes he wanted to speak about. He would talk about how the pursuit of success had blinded him to what truly mattered in life, how taking a step back had allowed him to find peace, and how embracing uncertainty had opened doors he never thought possible. He also reached out to a local conference organizer, asking if there were any opportunities for someone to share a personal story of reinvention. It was a long shot, but James was tired of waiting for the perfect moment. He wanted to create that moment himself. A week later, he got a response. "James, thank you for reaching out. We'd love to have you speak at our next event. We're always looking for people who have made a major life shift and can share their experience. Let's schedule a time to talk more about your story." James felt a surge of excitement mixed with nerves. He had done it. He had taken the first step towards something new, something he had once thought was beyond him. He didn't know exactly what would come from this speaking engagement, but it didn't matter. He was finally doing something for himself. Over the next few weeks, James threw himself into preparing for his speaking debut. He spent hours rehearsing in front of the mirror, refining his message, and making sure his words would resonate with others. There were times when he doubted himself, wondering if anyone would care about his story. But he reminded himself that the value wasn't in the outcome, it was in the process. It was in being brave enough to share his truth. Finally, the day arrived. James stood backstage at the conference, his palms sweating as he waited for his turn to speak. The auditorium was packed with people from all walks of life, each one there to hear a story of transformation, of growth. The room hummed with anticipation, and for a brief moment, James thought about backing out. But then he reminded himself why he was here to take that leap, to share his journey. The moment the host introduced him, James took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight hit him, and for a second, everything went quiet. The nerves were still there, but so was something else, a sense of purpose, a sense of peace. He had come full circle. The man who had once been paralyzed by the fear of failure, was now standing before a crowd, ready to share his story. He began by telling them about his life in the corporate world, the long hours, the endless ambition, and the loneliness that had come with it. He spoke about the moment he had decided to leave it all behind and find a new path. And he shared how, through his journey, he had learned that true success wasn't measured by titles or salaries. It was measured by how fulfilled you felt, by the relationships you nurtured, and by the peace you found within yourself. As James spoke, he saw the faces in the audience shift. There were nods of understanding, moments of silence as they absorbed his words. When he finished, there was a pause, and then the room erupted in applause. James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. This was it. This was what he had been searching for. It wasn't about fame or fortune. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being true to himself and helping others find their own truth. As he walked off the stage, the applause still ringing in his ears, James knew that this was just the beginning. He had taken the leap, and the world felt a little bigger, a little more open. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it.